My name is Christopher Sands, and I'm director of the Canada Institute at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And this will be a short discussion of the impact of the Canadian trucker protest as it enters into its third week. The Canadian trucker protests are now entering their third week. From the beginning, they targeted Ottawa, the Canadian capital, with a dramatic drive from coast to arrive in the capital city and express their unhappiness. But in the last week, what the protests have now expanded to is blocking the actual border. It started in Coutts, Alberta, Sweetgrass, Montana, where they began blocking shipments of farm products, but has now escalated to the busiest crossing on the Canada-US border between Detroit and Windsor, where a single bridge carries more trade between the United States and Canada than the United States does with Western Europe and Japan in a given year. That's how vital this crossing is. Disrupting this is a major escalation on the part of the truckers. And what we're hearing now is a threat by the truckers to begin expanding those protests to nearby crossings like Port Huron-Sarnia between Michigan and Ontario, or the Niagara-Buffalo crossings over to Western New York between Ontario and New York. Those are the workarounds that most truckers would take if they found that there was a traffic snarl or some other problem getting across that one bridge. So as they create chaos and unpredictability for the supply chains, they're forcing businesses to make rapid adjustments in order to be able to deliver products. This is already coming at a time when the supply chains have been shaken by the COVID and by inflation and by scarcity of key things like semiconductor chips and other products. It's a major test for both economies and is likely to continue as long as this uncertainty lasts to press inflation higher and raise the cost of doing business in North America with long-run impacts on our competitiveness. The truck driver protest has been remarkably successful. Certainly everyone in Canada and a great many people in the United States and around the world have heard about their being upset about the vaccine mandate. But as this has started to really pinch the vital Detroit-Windsor crossing, the pressure on the government of Canada to intervene to break up the protest using police forces or military means is growing. And we've seen the mayor of Windsor, for example, calling for emergency police powers to be able to break up this protest. It is in the short run putting people out of work and causing real hardship. But in the medium term, it's even more dangerous for Canada. Canada struggles to remain a vital partner in North American supply chains. It works very hard to be part of our auto industry. These kinds of border disruptions are going to be an incentive in the medium term for even Canadian-owned companies to set up production in the United States so that they don't have any border risk. But while the factory may go and the plant and equipment may go over to Ohio or Indiana, the jobs will also go, and that will leave Canadians without work. So while this protest is meant to support freedom and reject some of the what are seen as maybe arbitrary mandates by the Canadian government, the pain here is not just going to be felt by politicians. It could be felt by Canadians economically for a generation or more if it's not resolved quickly. There are many protest movements around the country that are drawing inspiration from the truck drivers in Canada in trying to push back against some of the COVID policies that have been imposed, trying to keep people safe, but perhaps now with vaccination being more widespread, seeming a bit redundant and almost authoritarian to some citizens. This is one of the reasons that this has become such an issue. Canada can't solve this problem entirely on its own, but how it chooses to respond to these particular protests will be a shot heard around the world. It's very important for the United States, therefore, to think about this not as a Canadian problem on the other side of the border, but as a case in point. And how the US and Canadian governments react to reopen the border to trade will be looked at very carefully by protesters worldwide and could spark more protests, or perhaps a new approach, recognizing that the governments are finally beginning to respond to this outrage. An interesting element of this particular protest is the role of the United States. Certainly early on, the truck protesters were receiving funds and a lot of support in social media from Americans on the other side of the border who saw this as an echo of some of the protests here in the United States against mask mandates and vaccinations. What we haven't yet seen are US truck drivers joining in sympathy and trying to block the American side of some of the bridges that have been targeted by Canadian truckers. They might well agree with Canadian truckers and choose to do this, bringing that problem very much directly home to the United States. We haven't seen it yet, but this is one of the things we'll be watching in the weeks ahead. Over the course of the border restrictions, which at the Canada-US border date back to March 2020 and are about to come up to their second anniversary, there have been a number of suggestions for how to handle truck drivers better. At the very beginning, the governments in the US, Canada, and Mexico designated truck drivers as essential workers and allowed them to cross the border without any vaccination or testing. That had continued up until relatively recently, when the new border requirements that the US has as well for truck drivers to be vaccinated were imposed. However, as many people, including the members of the Wilson Task Force on Public Health in the US-Canadian border, have emphasized, there are programs that have long been in place and were underutilized by the governments of the US and Canada that could have helped in this situation. For example, the Free and Secure Trade Program, which builds on the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism dating back to the days after 9/11, does involve large companies who agree to undertake several steps to secure their supply chain so that risk management at the border is easier. Companies are spending literally millions of dollars to maintain access in this program. And in exchange, DHS and Canada's Border Services Agency have pledged to give expedited crossing and expedited access for trucks in the program during periods of emergency or some kind of blockage. Here we are back in a period of emergency, and it's very clear that neither the United States nor Canada can deliver on this promise, despite the amount of money that has been spent. There is an obvious solution. Use these trusted traveler programs and trusted shipper programs and add the requirement that those people who participate in that program have had their vaccinations. This alone would take a large number of the drivers out of the risk pool, and then you'd be talking about a relatively few drivers that you would then have to focus on. I think that would take a lot of the wind out of the protest and make the private sector, which is so dependent on these truck drivers for their supply chain, a partner in trying to improve the public health of both countries. Instead, what we've seen is the government's acting alone, acting without much warning, so that it's difficult for the private sector to adjust. And while they may be acting in the best interests of public safety, they're not acting in the best interests of our competitiveness or our economic growth. So as we come through this important period, I think there's a lot that the governments could do that isn't withdrawing mandates, but being smarter about imposing them, that would help us to get away from these protests and into a more constructive frame.